Jan Timman has died aged 74. He was the successor to Max Over in the Netherlands and enjoyed huge popularity and recognition in his home country. Timman was known as the best of the West. So outside the Soviet players, the strongest Western player in the late 1970s and early 80s. I remember when he played in Hastings, probably 73, 74. And he looked like a rock star. He looked like Robert Plant, the lead singer of Led Zepp. And players like him and Tony Miles, you know, they look really cool. And for me, they were role models. You know, I thought chess playing, well, okay, that could be a pretty cool way to make a living. And indeed, the reason that Timman became a chess player was because he loved the hippie-ish lifestyle, the individuality and the freedom that he had, but still with a clear purpose. Timman was adventurous off and on the chessboard. He had enormous confidence. He feared no one. He loved chess, but it wasn't his whole life. He had a great interest in music, of course, and literature. You know, he wrote essays on Dostoevsky, for example, and he liked the good life. He enjoyed a glass of wine. In 1981, he was the number 2 in the world behind Karpov. And after that, Kasparov leapt over both of them. Although Timman worked hard at his chess, you know, he loved the game, he didn't have the same discipline as, let's say, Kasparov. Timman enjoyed writing, annotating classic games, certainly not just his own. And this book, The Art of Chess Analysis, well, for me, again, that was really inspirational work. And you can see how well thumbed it is. The book is practically falling apart. That was a new style of annotation, you know, with words, explanation, but also with, you know, concrete variations as well. Brilliantly done. In his latter years, Timman devoted a great deal of time to compositions. You know, he loved the beauty of chess. And this is a great book, The Art of the Endgame. My Journeys in the Magical World of Endgame Studies. So he looks at other people's studies, but then he links them with his own as well, into themes. It's a really nice book. And what I'd like to do is look at a couple of Timman's own endgame compositions. I think that would be a worthy tribute to him, instead of looking at one of his games. By the way, if you'd like to read a detailed obituary, I can recommend Peter Dogger's on chess.com. So I'll put the link to that down below. And yeah, he gives a really good account of Timman's life. So let's take a look at a couple of Jan Timman's compositions. Timman composed this study in 1989. I wouldn't say it's one of his deeper compositions, but it contains a really nice idea, and it also appeals to me because it looks like it could come from an actual game. So it's white to play, and, well, first of all, of course, if you'd like to try and solve it yourself, please do. But you can see pretty quickly that white is in trouble. Not only is this knight attacked, but this bishop as well. Now, there's a pass pawn on a6, but yeah, the real problem is this piece. So what does white do? There's only one move that white has to keep going, and that's knight g4. So it's clear that white is playing for a draw here. Now, this knight is not in a stable position. It can be attacked with either h5 or bishop f5. Now, h5 doesn't work because of knight f6. King takes bishop, knight takes bishop. That's okay for white. But bishop f5 is serious. The knight is attacked. And really there's only one sensible way to keep going. You can try and get rid of this bishop with bishop h2. Give up that piece, and then bishop g1. But after the exchange, bishop f5 controls the queening square, and black wins very easily. The bishop is the right colour for when you promote the h-pawn, basically. One of these will go through. Okay, let's come back here. So just let's go from the beginning again. So we've got knight g4, and now bishop f5, and the only move for white to keep going is knight takes h6. Now, if the bishop is taken, this is different, because after knight takes bishop, king takes king h2. This is just a draw, because it's the wrong colour bishop. You can't control this one, so that's just a draw with this rook's pawn. So after knight takes, black plays bishop e4. Now it's getting serious, because the bishop is attacked, but also h3 is threatened. So for example, knight g4 defends the bishop, but then h3 just wins, followed by takes and here. So the only move to keep going is knight f7. And one of the points is that if h3, then the knight hops back. Now, in fact, you don't take this one. The cleanest is to play knight takes bishop. And again, well, this is just an instant draw, basically. So, knight f7 played. So, king takes knight. Okay, so now black is a piece up and threatens h3. So, king h2. And now g3, exchanging off the last pawn, is the threat. That'll just be a draw. But black plays bishop f5. So if g3, then h3, and black wins this position. Okay, so what does white play here? This is the really hard move to foresee. White to play. Are you ready? Bishop g3. Fantastic move. So threatening to take the h-pawn. And after pawn takes bishop, check. Don't play king takes pawn, because after picking up this pawn, well, it'll be an easy win, easy to checkmate with two bishops. But instead, the king goes back to h1. And that is a stone cold draw. Now, the first thing is that, well, if black isn't careful, then it's an immediate draw by stalemate. And if, yeah, something like this, then do that and draw. If bishop g1, take it. Bishop e4. Okay, it's no longer stalemate. However, this is a fortress. Black can pick up this pawn, big deal. The black king can approach, but whenever it does, it'll be stalemate. So it's a well-known fortress. And what else have we got? Bishop here. Pawn takes, king f6, and king g2. And this pawn is going to be picked up. So, quick recap. Really beautiful. So, knight g4, bishop f5, knight takes h6, bishop e4, threatening h3, knight f7, nice move, king takes, king h2, and then the killer move, bishop g3, and if pawn takes, king h1. And that's a draw. Fantastic stuff. Now for something completely different. Timman composed this in 2011 when he was doing a lot of work on his endgame book. Looks a little bit chaotic. So let's try and take stock before we plunge into variations. It's quite complex. So white is a rook up. That's the good news. Bad news is there's some activity here. That's threatening to make a queen, and yeah, there are problems here as well, as we'll see. So the first move is clear. White has to stop the pawn advancing, so king g2. Now this is a slightly unusual defense, but let's just go along with it. Black needs to do this. So queen, give up the queen, but there is a point to this. And then bishop b2. So the rook is attacked. Of course, if the rook is taken, it's a draw. So where does the rook move? The problem is if rook f1, then c2, and black makes a queen, white has to give up the rook, it's a draw. Okay, what about a check? Then king b6 this is a problem. The king threatens the knight can't move because the rook will be on prise, and if pawn takes pawn, in fact this is the simplest way to make a draw. And yeah, white is going to lose this knight. Rook against bishop is a draw. So in this position, white has to find something a bit special. So that's when you look at all the forcing moves. So knight d6 check. And now the king has to step very carefully. If king c6, then rook a6 check. The king can't approach the rook. Pawn takes pawn. White is just going to be a rook up, and that's winning. So after knight d6, black has to play king c7. So again, there's a problem. The knight is attacked, the rook is attacked, c2, c1 is a problem. So white has to keep going here. So knight e8 check. Now, again, the king has to be very careful. If king d8, then rook a8 check, followed by pawn takes pawn, white is a rook up. Okay, what about king c6? Well, then rook a6 check, and the trickiest variation to spot is if king b7, you've got rook a2. That's a beautiful move. So if c2, then rook takes bishop check, and then you take the pawn. Okay, so after knight e8 check, the king has to go to d7. So again, the knight is attacked, and c2 threatened, and the rook is threatened. So white's move is forced, knight f6 check. Again, if king e6 and the rook checks, then that's an easy win for white. White's a rook up. So you have to play king e7. So the knight and the king sort of perform this crab-like dance across the board. Knight g8 check. King f7. Got to play knight h6. Again, king g6 would be met by rook a6, so got to play king g7. Knight f5 check. Now, if king f6, then rook f1, and there's going to be a deadly discovered check. So, for example, c2, knight d4, take this. So after knight f5, got to play king g6. Knight h4 check. King g5, and this is all forced. Knight f3 check. Again, king f4 runs into rook f1, and it's going to be a horrible discovered check. So after knight f3, king g4 is forced. Now, if knight h2, now this is why the king was dragged to the corner. If knight h2, king h3, and black draws. Once the rook moves, c2 comes, that's it. So, for example, rook g1, c2, and c1, draw. But white has an unbelievable move here. Can you spot it? White to play. The only move to win is rook a2. It's a very subtle move. So if king takes f3, then pawn takes pawn. So the bishop is attacked. Now bishop takes pawn will be met by rook a3, pinning. So bishop c1 is the only move. Now white has this c-pawn running down the board. If king e4, now if the king manages to capture the pawn, it's a draw. But, well, for example, rook a1, very nice move, followed by rook d1. Cut the king and then run the pawn. So, after rook a2, what else has black got? Well, I suppose the obvious move is c2 as before. The pawn is going to advance. Okay, this is a bit problematic. But white has a beautiful move here. Knight e5 check. So if king f5, then knight d3, and okay, you can make a queen, but knight takes, and white is a rook for bishop up, and the d pawn will decide. So after knight e5 check, bishop takes knight has to be played, rook takes pawn. Okay, so white has made progress, rook against the bishop and this d pawn. But after king f3, you have to find the right move here. And this is really, really deep. There's only one move that wins, and that's rook c4. Just for a moment, cutting the king, preventing the king coming over. So bishop g3. Now, don't play d4, king e4. But first rook check. Whoops, rook check. So the king has to keep hold of the bishop. And now d4. Timman wrote, "You can also start a game with this move, but in these circumstances, on an almost empty board, it can be quite effective. Black cannot stop the passed pawn anymore." So this one is going to run. The king is too far away. I mean, let me just play on a few moves. So if, for example, if h4, d5, king f5, and now cut the king again. And yeah, you're going to be able to follow up with the king. And slowly but surely, black is going to lose. I mean, that is really something else. Let's just go from the beginning. So the reason that this was played was to force the king here, and later on that gives black some room to come over this side of the board. So I'm just going to show you the main line. Check. Okay, check again. So the king has to sort of march over, keep attacking the knight. And again, another check, another check. And here is the brilliant, brilliant move. How do you compose this stuff? I don't know. Rook a2. Absolutely brilliant. And I should say that Timman was not computer friendly, and he didn't like working with computers. So if you think this is, he sort of plugged this into a machine to get some position, that's not right. This came from his mind. And then knight e5 takes, rook c4 only move, and then d4 and so on. Absolutely fantastic. And I would really recommend that book. It shows you how Timman appreciated beauty in chess, and he composed some wonderful studies.